Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Teaching to Kill a Mockingbird, a professional development webinar sponsored by America in Class from the National Humanities Center. I'm Richard Schramm, the Vice President for Education Programs here at the Center, and I'll be moderating this evening's session. Before we get underway, I'd like to introduce the Center to you briefly. We're the only independent institute for advanced study in all branches of the humanities in the country. That simply means that we're independent, we're a private nonprofit organization. We're an institute for advanced study. That means that the main program here is a fellowship program that brings scholars to the center for an academic year to research and write on topics in the humanities, history, literature and language studies, philosophy, criticism of the arts, that sort of thing. The center also maintains a very active program of outreach to teachers, high school teachers of American history and literature primarily. We market all of our programs and resources for high school teachers under americainclass.org. You folks have discovered our webinars. If you go to americainclass.org, you'll land on this page, and from here, you can gain access to all of the other resources that the National Humanities Center provides for the teaching of American history and literature. At the end of our seminar this evening, if you'll return to the Teaching to Kill a Mockingbird website, there you'll find a recording of this evening's presentation along with a PowerPoint. We ask you to, you can plunder the PowerPoint. It's there for your teaching. Take it back to your classes. Use it however you wish. We also ask you to submit the evaluation form you will find on this website. Send that back to us. That's important to us. We pay attention to what you say. Once we have received that, you'll be able to download a certificate of participation, and you'll be able to take that to your local certifying authority to obtain whatever recertification credit your participation in this evening's webinar warrants. How do you participate? Well, as we go through our presentation this evening, we'll be stopping to ask questions, and we hope then that you'll respond by putting your cursor in the green box that I have bracketed there. That's at the lower right hand of your screen. Type your response, hit that send button to the right, and your message will appear in the large chat box above. I'll be following the chat all evening and bringing it into the conversation at appropriate times. But don't wait for us to pose a question. Please ask your own questions or make comments. Give us feedback on how you teach the material. If you see a passage that is particularly usable in class, let us know how you would present it. And if you see a potential project or assignment in the material, share it with us. We really want you to participate. Remember, ladies and gentlemen, the more you participate, the better the webinar. Okay, so let us get underway. You posed some interesting questions and comments in the forum. One teacher wrote, students have difficulty relating to the social, regional, and cultural context of the novel. Strangely, the issues related to gender roles during the period seem more foreign to my students than many of the racial issues. I'm not entirely sure what to make of that comment. It may suggest that those racial issues are still with us. I don't know. We had two questions. How does Harper Lee's new novel, to be published this summer, relate to Kill a Mockingbird? And was Harper Lee's privacy of her own choosing, or was it partly her sister's decision? These are kind of related questions. If you saw the piece in the New York Times this morning, the debate about whether or not she was more or less coerced into publishing this new novel has heated up as the Alabama Department of Protective Services begins to look into whether or not she was forced to do that. Those two questions are not directly germane to our seminar this evening. We'll hold them in abeyance, and if we have time at the end of our program tonight, we'll ask Professor McKeithen to address them, and we'll also solicit your opinions on the matter. But let us get underway. We are very pleased to have with us this evening Lucinda McKeithen, a professor of English emeritus at North Carolina State University. Cindy was a fellow here at the National Humanities Center in 1984-85. She has written widely on Southern literature. 1992, she published Daughters of Time, Creating the Women's Voice in Southern History. So Cindy, why don't you tell us about To Kill a Mockingbird? It's all yours.
Okay, can you hear me? I
We
hope.
can hear you. You're coming through loud and
Oh,
clear.
hallelujah. Okay, let's go. I'm delighted to be with you tonight and delighted to especially be talking about this book that is more and more relevant every year, maybe no more so than this year. So we are off and running. Um, the tack that I would like to take tonight is in large part to consider To Kill a Mockingbird an historical novel, and as such, one that exists in different time frames. going to pick one of those three time frames to concentrate on as we go. As we look at the very beginning of To Kill a Mockingbird, there is a quotation that I think sets the historical issues involved in the novel in the forefront in a way that helps us to address and to define what we even mean by a historical novel. So as Scout is looking back at the beginning of the novel in a way that I think also addresses a narrative point of view, where we so often have the young Scout and the older seeker, who might very well be the author, uh, looking almost together at the world that they're in. But in this particular quotation, of course, it is the older narrator looking back. And just that sense and that term, looking back, is something that I think we want to stress, that the novel automatically, through this idea of looking back, exists on a plane where it is going back and forward at the same time. Events are being looked back at the same time that they are happening in Scout's own young 9-year-old presence. And the argument, as Jeb and Scout often argue, is what began it? And in this sense, as we think about where is the beginning of something and where is the end, I think one of the things that might make this whole novel more available to young people in the present is this whole idea of how do we tell time, and how are we all a part of a chain of events that goes back much farther. And I think kids have an interesting time looking back to try to figure out, when did something actually begin. Certainly that's what Jeb and Scout are doing at the very beginning of this novel. And as they do so, of course, we go all the way back to Andrew Jackson. And as we do that, we realize that the far past is connected to us in important ways. This little quotation here exists on genealogical time, too. We tell time through our ancestors by thinking about our grandparents, great grandparents, etc. And here sits Simon Finch. He hadn't paddled up the Alabama River. And we tell time chronologically, going back through Andrew Jackson. And we, of course, tell time, especially in this novel, what we might say is consequentially. That is, before and after. After something happens, there is a break, and what happened before it becomes on a different plane. So as we think of all these time elements, let's think about how historical novels work. There are immediately three different times. There's a setting time, there is the writer time, and there is the reader time. The time in which the novel is set, and here's an example from Gone with the Wind. It was set during the period of the Civil War and the period immediately after that in the South. The time that it was written by Margaret Mitchell in the 1920s and 30s was a time of the Depression, of nostalgia for the past. And of course, for Margaret Mitchell, what was going on around her in those 20s and 30s certainly made their way into the novel, and into her own interests came Scarlett O'Hara, who existed as a plantation belle, but in some ways reflected Margaret Mitchell herself and her own life during that period. For readers of every decade since that time, Gone with the Wind has meant different things to different people. Women in Great Britain in the 1940s read it like the Bible because it reflected their experience during war. In the 60s, Gone with the Wind takes on a new meaning because it relates to new questions about women's sexuality and feminism and objectification. And so the future, the time in which a book is read from 1940 to 2015, changes the way we read the novel and what it means to us. how it exists in our time frame. And the second example there, of course, is from The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, which, while it was set in the slave South, really means a great deal more and, and is easier to understand, I think, if you reflect on the fact that Twain wrote it during the period of the 1880s as a satire on the New South and the problem of re-enslaving the free black man. And of course, beginning in the 60s, not even a little bit earlier, Huckleberry Finn itself comes under a great deal of racism itself, and read in that frame of mind from from then to now in 2015, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn means something very different. So, uh, when we think about the time frames of To Kill a Mockingbird, for a long time, it really was read as a novel that reflected the 1930s. And in To Kill a Mockingbird, we hear from that authorial voice about how slow people move, how um, how it was a time of optimism for some people, and the quotation from Franklin Delano Roosevelt is there to tell us that this is a time of the Depression. Not much was going on, particularly in the South. And of course, there is the next time frame, which is the time in which um, Harper Lee wrote the novel itself. And I have these quotations from um, historians thinking about the 1950s, in the time in which Harper Lee actually wrote the novel. And I think one of the interesting things that is said about that time and about her sitting there writing this novel in the 1950s, as she did, um, that writing the novel had to be an act of protest in and of itself. It may look like it's dealing with events in the 1930s, but written in the 1930s, whatever Harper Lee was going to say about the South and about race, and about lynching, and about change coming to this region, to this nation in that time period, was going to have to drop somewhat like a bomb. Certainly, Harper Lee might very well have been expected to understand that. Um, Go ahead, Richard, a comment?
Cindy, I was just going to ask a question. Is there any indication that Harper Lee was consciously thinking of the events of the 1950s when she wrote To Kill a Mockingbird? And ladies and gentlemen, we're having a little trouble with the audio. Cindy's voice is fading in and out. We
Oh no,
Yeah,
not again.
we tried to fix that, and I'm really sorry about that. We'll try to. There's not much we can do about it at this point. Please just bear with us on that. But let me get back to my question. Is there any indication that she was consciously thinking of these things, the issues of the 50s that we're going to go into in a moment, when she was writing To Kill a Mockingbird?
We do have a few things from interviews that she made in the 1960s, and I'll be getting to those in just a minute. So let's hold that and take a look at what she did actually say she was thinking about when she was asked about it at that time. What she said hasn't really been, I don't think, stressed enough or looked at enough in terms of some of the questions that it raises, as well as answers about what was in her mind when she was writing in the 1950s. But we'll get to that in just a second. Um, as we think about the third time frame of the novel, and that is, of course, our own time, Scott Truro said something that I think is very interesting, and that our teachers right now might be interested in thinking about. As he says, it still speaks fundamental truth, um, and that's that's of course a question that I think students might be led to think about. What fundamental truth about life in 2015 is this novel talking about? And I'd be interested to know whether any of the teachers have.
Well, why don't we stop at this point and ask about that? How we could expand that question a little bit and ask our teachers how they teach the novel now, and do contemporary events impinge upon their teaching? Um, Wait, take a minute or two to see if we can get any comments upon that to bring our audience into the conversation. And in the meantime, Cindy, why don't we move ahead to the next point?
Okay. Um, there is another quotation on this page that, of course, brings up one answer to our own question, and that is the events of Ferguson. If you go online and do a Google search, you'll find that a lot of people have connected To Kill a Mockingbird to the events of Ferguson. And of course, Ferguson has been back in the news as late as today in a way that is kind of surprising, but uh, but not really. And as we are looking at this quotation, I liked this one. I wanted to use it because it's not a political kind of statement. It was actually in a health magazine where the writer was thinking not just about Ferguson, but about issues related to young black men and the lives they lead and how their lives are made different in this country in terms of many health issues, not just the potential for being shot in the streets, but their life expectancy, the kind of diseases they have, the poverty they live in, the imprisonment that is high for them. And so this quotation from a health magazine not too long ago also points out in 2015 in an area that's not in an arena that's not quite so political.
Yeah, Cindy, if I may interject here, what strikes me as interesting about that quote is the extent to which it indicates how To Kill a Mockingbird has become a cultural touchstone. I mean, this is a magazine on health, it's not a political magazine, and yet the writer felt that uh, he or she could frame those comments around To Kill a Mockingbird. I think that attests to its stature in our culture today.
I think it's a whole language. It provides a whole language that so many people have read the book and learned the book in many different contexts that it's relatable to a tremendously wide spectrum of issues, and not just race and law, but coming of age, young womanhood. All of those things are definitely a part of this novel's way to relate to a wide variety of contexts. So, with that in mind, the focus of our discussion as we go through the novel itself is going to be on the cultural pressures and events of the 1950s, which of course presaged and ushered in the terrifically explosive rights in the 1960s and beyond. And of course, the civil rights issues that today certainly provide a whole new theater for To Kill a Mockingbird to act
Mhm.
upon.
Sandy, we have an interesting comment here from one of our participants. She writes, "I don't teach this novel, but I just finished teaching The Outsiders to my seventh grade class. Even though we did current events in class and some students focused on Ferguson, the book brings up unnamed teens being killed by cops. My students didn't make the same connections between the book and the world that I did, but sometimes I think they're too young to get that far." That's an interesting comment, particularly in light of the comment that was made in the forum about students not really catching the racial issues, but catching more of the social, gendered issues. Another question I would like to pose to our participants is, when is this novel taught in school? Is it taught in middle school, early high school? Because I think that would influence the way students view it in contemporary terms. Uh, would you agree with that, Cindy, or not?
Um, the issue of the contemporary term available to
Yeah, yeah,
younger
I think,
readers.
yeah, yeah. What would you think about that? I mean, do you think it would make much difference if this was taught in, say, eighth grade as opposed to 11th grade?
Yes, I think certainly the issues are going to be a good bit different. I know a 13-year-old who absolutely with the novel and the film in ways that I didn't expect him to, but they weren't, again, the ways I would have quite have thought about. He had no interest in seeing the films. Selma, for instance. History is something that belonged to other people, but I think that part of the challenge of this novel and teaching it is, in some ways, to think of ways to get the 13-year-old to be able to think historically,
Right. Right.
to put himself or herself into history
Right.
and into national events. And certainly, I think a junior in high school is able to do that a good bit better. But since, in my experience, it is taught so much, at least around North Carolina in middle school, it's I think, a terrifically valuable challenge for younger students to begin to understand how they are themselves in history, and they're in that history as well as the
Right. Well, the responses we've gotten are interesting. This novel is taught from the eighth grade. One teacher said she would teach it at an eighth grade gifted class, and then it is taught straight through to the 11th grade. So it gets a wide coverage out there at schools across the nation. So, shall we move ahead then?
It does. Sure. Sure. Here's the answer to your question. A couple of responses that Harper Lee actually gave when she was asked about To Kill a Mockingbird and what she was thinking when she wrote it. And the quotations, I think, might be interesting to show to students and see if they get a sense of contradiction a little bit, because that is going to be, I think, an honest way to teach this novel is to indicate that there is some ambivalence in it, on the part of the author, and especially on the part of the author as she portrays Atticus Finch. And there's some reflection of that here, where partly the book, as she herself says, is to its purpose for her in writing it was to say that there aren't lynchings before every breakfast. Now, I think this is in some ways a way to argue that this novel is relating to a lot of history going on right around her in the 1950s, especially the horrible murder of Emmett Till. Um, and yet, here she's trying to indicate that the South isn't really like that, and that Southerners, or and she doesn't say some Southerners, she says Southerners react with the same kind of horror as other people. And then her asked if her book is an indictment. Notice she says that it's a plea, a reminder to people at home. And that quotation is very interesting. I'd love to know what our own audience tonight might think of that. What is she trying to remind the people at home? And by that, I think she certainly means the South. The people. What is she trying to remind them? Actually, she's pleading with them
Hmm.
to remember something, and I wonder what that something might be.
Well, let's ask. That's a very good question. Let's pose that to our participants. The book is not an indictment so much as a plea for something, a reminder to people at home. What is she trying to remind them of? And let me elaborate on that a bit. It seems to me that the book is an indictment against is not an indictment, but it's actually an apology for the South. I mean, the South was it had become once again the sort of number one moral problem in the country, and I think she is to some extent apologizing for it in the sense of making a case for it. The entire first half of the novel is a kind of idyll. I mean, race and violence don't enter into it until Mr. Radley shoots his shotgun off at people, the kids, when they're trying to get up to his house. And the next day, the town interprets that as Radley shooting at black folks who were trying to get into his collard patch. So right there is the connection between violence and race. But except for that, until you really get into the rape case, it's an idol for the South. True, it's 1936, but it's a small town. Everybody knows each other. The kids are safe. They have a great, they have a happy childhood. Um, is it also an apology for the South at this time, do you think, Cindy?
Well, she seems she seemed certainly defensive in that first quotation. Uh, and I would say, yes, it seems like an apology in the first half, but once you get into the second half, and I hope I can show this by looking just at some things in the first part that change their symbolism completely when you get into the second part. So, like she is trying to say, we're not all like that, we're good people. But once you get into the second part, I think you have to go back and take a new look at the first part and see that there are all kinds of foreshadowings and even some commentaries where that
Hmm.
idol is going to be confronted and challenged when you get into the second part.
Right. And we have one of our participants write this is a plea for decency, perhaps, a reminder that most Southerners are decent. Maybe that's what she's saying. Um, there is a section in the novel where someone suggests that Northerners have their own problems with race. Another participant's written something really interesting here. I teach it to low-level sophomores. I asked them to do journals about Ferguson and Eric Gardner while we were reading it this year. They tended to be not as fired up as I thought they would be. I had some students who really wanted to talk debate, but many who really could not, did not want to see any connections. Let me, while we're going through this, let me pose another question to our teachers. Uh, how do white students respond to this novel, and how do your black students respond to this novel? I'm sure there's a difference. Share with that. Share with us how your white and black students respond to Kill a Mockingbird. Okay, Cindy, shall we move ahead then?
Sure. And while they're thinking about that, what I'd like to do is offer you all a timeline that indicates, I think, how closely Harper Lee was to the events of the 1950s as not only a rehearsal, but as the beginning domino falling to create the civil rights era. She was born in 1926. Her father was a tax lawyer. Her father was not much like Atticus. I want to stress that. He's always people because he was a kind of lawyer um, and did a few of the same things that Atticus does. But he wasn't her model. In some ways, she actually indicated that perhaps her own older sister was more a model because her older sister followed her father into the law and was a model of terrific courage. And courage is certainly such a major theme. Um, if we move forward chronologically, I think the important thing is that while Harper Lee studied law, she wasn't really interested in it, and she wanted to be a writer, and she wanted to be somewhat like her very good childhood friend Truman Capote. So she went to New York, where she hung out with him, and like him, began to write. I was introduced to all his friends. He was the high flyer. She was considered somewhat dumpy, but she wasn't going to stop. And so, beginning in the early 50s, while she actually worked as an airline ticket uh, seller, she was writing. And while she was in New York during those 5 years, if we just take a quick look at what in the world is going on in the South and in the nation, beginning with, of course, the momentous year 1954, which ushered in desegregation, but also, of course, dug in a horrific period of digging in, where the South decided they absolutely were not going to follow the nation's ruling on this issue of school desegregation. Um, and of course, the really horrific parallel to Tom Robinson was the murder of a 14-year-old Emmett Till um, in in Money, Mississippi, uh, and its aftermath, where the men who committed the murder actually while were acquitted in a few minutes. It didn't take in reality any time to declare them innocent, and then confessed that they had actually committed the murder. And the other event that I think certainly Harper Lee was very, very interested in was the enrolling of authoring Lucy in 1956 into the University of Alabama, Harper Lee's own university, where there was a tremendous amount of violence surrounding her admission to that university, and she ended up withdrawing. Um, we, when we move into 1956, this is when Harper Lee is taking 5 short stories to her agent, and they are a rough draft of To Kill a Mockingbird. By the way, they are almost certainly what is being now marketed as a brand new novel. Um, it's probably the first 2 or 3 drafts of To Kill a Mockingbird that are going to be presented to us as a new novel this summer. But she wrote, in other words, she wrote the book of what became To Kill a Mockingbird. Much changed, by the way. She was going to change it a lot, but she wrote it during that time period of the murder of Emmett Till, the failed admission of a smart young black woman to the University of Alabama, and worked on it then for the following years as well. When uh, during a time when, for instance, the schools are desegregated in Arkansas, um, and another lynching takes place in Mississippi, and uh, the violence and mayhem simply continued through the whole time that Harper Lee was writing and redrafting her novel, which was in 1960.
Cindy, go ahead, please.
Yes.
Finish this, and I'll jump in.
No,
Please go right ahead.
well, I just wanted to finish the timeline by indicating she worked on that novel right up to January of 1960. Um, and remember, Rosa Parks has been taking her stand, and it is possible, I think, to say that Harper Lee, in writing this novel, is taking her stand as well in the same region, dealing with the same horrors, and trying to figure out a way to fight positive.
Yeah, I
Okay.
think your timeline here has answered my question earlier about whether or not she was thinking about these things consciously. I don't see how anybody writing during this time, writing about race in the South, could ignore these issues. They had to impinge upon her consciousness. If I could just go back for a moment to my question about how white students and African American students respond to this, we've gotten some really interesting comments that
Right.
uh, tell us all a lot, speak volumes about the diversity of contemporary America. I teach mostly Latino students. They do not see connections in the South against black people, African Americans, as connecting to their lives at all. They see discrimination against Latinos as a separate entity and therefore seem to be disinterested in the prejudice in the novel. And then another participant writes, there's a lot of tension between Latinos and African American communities in Los Angeles, where I live, and she asks where other participants are. Many of my students make connections between the Emmett Till case, and the Scottsboro trials as well, and they do make connections between the book and some historical events. And we have teachers, by the way, from all over the place: Los Angeles, New York, North Carolina. So if since this does seem the responses do seem to vary by region, it might be interesting to tell us where you teach. If you Central New York, they're a participant. Um, if you respond to that question. But Cindy, let's move ahead then. This timeline, by the way, I think is great. I have a sneaking suspicion it's going to show up in a lot of classes. I know I'd use it if I were back teaching. Thanks for giving us this.
Well, great. Well, and this brings me a chance to bring up something that I wanted to bring up anyway. I right here in North Carolina, the growing Hispanic population is in our schools, and there are problems between African Americans and Hispanics in our schools in North Carolina. And so, in thinking about this book, I think one of the wonderful things that it would be nice if it could do would be to bridge that gap, the gap between white and African American students, and also the gap between Hispanic and African American and white students. And one way to do that just dawned on me the other day because Selma happened the other day, 1965. Again, Harper Lee knew all about Selma in 1965 when that march happened. And in President Obama's speech, in Selma on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of that march. He is, I think, making an amazing bridge between the Hispanic situation of today. He talks about the path to citizenship, which was as hard for African Americans, and then the path to full citizenship as the path to citizenship is right now with Hispanics facing just in the last few weeks, of course, the battles about immigration and whether a large number of immigrants are going to be able to avoid being deported. Um, and another thing he said in his speech that I think really relates to the present is, he said it very early on. He said, we can not examine this moment in isolation. And then he also said, Selma is not a museum or a static monument. In other words, and then he talked to everybody in his audience and said, you know, we are all born of change. And when you think of those things, that uh, what happened in To Kill a Mockingbird was not a moment in isolation. Selma was not a moment in isolation. One of the major themes of To Kill a Mockingbird, as we're going to see as we look, is change, the fear of change, the inevitability of change, the hope that change can happen um, peacefully. And so I think for Hispanic students today, as they think about path to citizenship being blocked and there being a great fear of the change that their presence brings, we can go right back to 1954 when the South, the white South, horrified and terrified of change, dug in its heels. And of course, that's exactly To Kill a Mockingbird. So as we move forward, we can think about that.
Yeah, we have a very interesting comment here from one of our participants in Los Angeles. I live in Los Angeles and I am Latina. This book resonated very deeply with me. It would help them, students, to understand the underlying history of the racism black people faced and face. Thank you, Renata. Good comment.
Great, great. Okay, this next quotation I found in a fascinating book about the 50s and 60s, and I think it would be fun to use this these quotations. One of them about the 50s and one of them about the 60s, um, and let students take a look at these words and then let them see where they see examples of these issues in To Kill a Mockingbird. Notice the 50s, rigid social hierarchy. Where do you see that in To Kill a Mockingbird? Subordination of women to men and children to parents, repressed attitudes to sex, racism, unquestioning respect for authority in the family, education, government, the law, and religion, etc. And then further down, even things such as um, formalism in language and etiquette and dress codes. Think about all those things that Arthur Marwick says are key features of the 1950s, and to find the wonderful examples all over the place in To Kill a Mockingbird that show that this is a novel of the 50s. But then also to look at the key features of the 60s, a youth culture and trend setting by young people. And do we see some of that beginning to happen in To Kill a Mockingbird, especially in the second half, where Scout and Jeb and Dill um, are not going to put up with the static culture of the past. And other wonderful things in that list that we begin to see, and especially down at the bottom, a counterculture in the making. Is there a way in which we can follow these three young, almost children, into their beginning steps into a new kind of counterculture? And where does the novel reflect that? So all of these things in these two quotations from this study of the 50s and 60s, I think, help us deal with the novel in a way that can help students make the lines between the novel and the world of the past that they are still a part of in the present. Okay, so the two themes following on those quotations from Arthur Marwick that we're going to be stressing for the novel are first, fear of change, um, especially in those who hold positions of authority and power in a structure that seems fixed, seems unchangeable, and by golly, it's not going to change. Stability, how things were done, being fixed, how everyone is held in their place. How does the novel reflect that? And then when and where do we begin to see visions of a different order, a counterculture, younger people with questions about authority, who are beginning not to be afraid to oppose what they are told, and who are seeking new kinds of alliances. So these will be our themes, and we'll begin to make our fast trip through the novel in order to take a look at some of the quotations that help us with these themes. And again, they are quotations that you could ask your students to do. Often quotation searches, key searches, as I like to call them, as students find keys that fit certain ideas. Here are some that they might find themselves. So, first, maintaining the status quo in this uh, in this world of Maycomb. And Maycomb itself, of course, is not just a town, it's a microcosm of the South, it's perhaps a microcosm of the nation, and it is itself a character. It has its own personality. So, in this first quotation, where Scout is telling us how Maycomb people think about northern Alabama, where their new teacher comes from, notice how Maycombites and Maycomb itself um, sees the world from the standpoint, and again, I think students can relate to this, of insiders and outsiders. I mean, North Alabama isn't that far away, but those people are outsiders. They are persons of no background, and so, of course, they don't count for much. Jeb, in his statement, um, that there is this kind of hierarchy, this ladder of who you like and who you don't like based on um, class and race, and that's Maycomb. That's it, you see. And then of course Scout on that class system. Uh, the present generation of people who had lived side by side were utterly predictable. So the status quo and the fixity of this world. You know everybody, you know what they're going to do. They might as well not do it because you know exactly what they're going to do before they do it, so that nothing can change in this world. And that's Maycomb. That's the world we live in. Is that the South that Harper Lee lived in? Is that our own nation or portions of it? This attempt to hold on to the status quo, things as they are, the safety. And of course, it's not just white people in power, but everyone begins to have this quotation, this is the way we do it. Um, at Calpurnia's church, there is Lula, who does not want to see those white children. They got their church, we got ours. Changing things, changing things. And then at the end of the novel, notice Maycomb is a character. It's not just one person, it's the whole chorus of townspeople, or at least one perception of them, okay? And to Maycomb, Tom's death was typical. In other words, you could expect it, you could have predicted it. This is just the way things are. This is what he would be bound to do, how they are. In other words, they don't change, we don't change. All of these quotations about the status quo.
Cindy, if I may interject here, you
Sure.
asked a good question. Is this the South? Is it the nation? I would argue that the division here in the novel, at least in terms of the small town life, is not so much southern and northern as it is rural and urban. I think you could probably find the same characteristics of a small town in the South, New England, the Midwest, um, the Far West. How would you respond to that? Do you think it's northern, southern, or more rural, urban?
Well, I think there is a lot of possibilities to that idea, and I think one of the things that we might bring in here is the fact that Remember, Harper Lee wrote this novel in New York. She had fled the South herself. She's sitting in New York City in that cosmopolitan urban world where people know so much more. And she loved New York City, but she also went home all the time. She traveled back and forth between the two. So as she's writing this novel, that whole issue of the urbane and the urban versus the closed-minded and the small town and the people out in the country. But of course, Maconites think they're better than the folks that live out in the country. And then, of course, it's also impossible not to see this division as being one of class, um, of poor whites um, versus those of us who have education and money and know how to dress, etc. So certainly, it's not just South versus North, or even primarily South versus North. Those other divisions are interchangeable, really.
Shall we move ahead then?
Yes, I wanted to relate Maycomb, which is itself a character, with two of its primary spokespeople, both of them women, Mrs. DuBose and Aunt Alexandra. And again, their statements are the statements of the town. They are really the spokespeople for what we might call Maycomb's point of view. Um, and when Mrs. DuBose talks about a finch going against his raising, what does that mean to your students? I'm wondering. What does it mean for a finch to go against his raising?
Okay, let's pose that to our participants. How would your students respond to that? What do you think they, and what do you make of that line, a finch going against his raising? Mrs. DuBose is an interesting character in the novel. And Atticus's response to her made me. It's one of the things that made me question Atticus. We can talk about that later on. Let's see
Yeah,
what our
and I
participants.
yeah.
Yeah, say what
Mhm.
our participants have to say about a finch going against his raising. We got some folks typing in. We'll take a.
And they might also be thinking about Aunt Alexandra's
Yeah.
idea that everybody simply has a streak. What does she mean by everybody having a streak? Is it in some way similar to going above your raising? What is a streak
Okay.
in this respect as well?
Uh, this is when a child begins to stand up to his or her parents. Finch going against his raising. Some more comments coming in. Yeah, that everybody has a streak. Drinking streak, gambling streak, mean streak, funny streak. Um,
Yes, yes. And if you have that streak, it's genetic.
that's right. It's
It's part
genetic.
of
This
who
is
you
this
are.
is this is
You can't change them.
right. Precisely. This is the way Maycomb defines people. If you've got that streak, you're going to have it, and that whole family has a streak. And going against their raising, if I may take a crack at that, I mean, it's you were raised a certain way in a certain family. You were expected to behave a certain way, and you're not. His raising being that his people do not associate with African Americans, much less defend them. Yes, in terms of the novel. But I do think it's what Jill is getting at here, too. If you have a streak, descendants cannot escape the past. Very good. But I think going against his raising, would you say that's, if you're raised in a certain family, the town, the community has expectations of you, and if you don't maintain those, you're going against your raising, and people really don't know what to make of you in that town.
Yes, that's right. And notice Anne Alexandra um, also uses the word tribal groups. Um, that's an interesting word to throw in here that I think students and again our teachers, what in the world does she mean? Well, and of course, this isn't Anne Alexandra speaking, but it's that adult scout or even Harper Lee saying that Anne Alexandra never lets a chance go by to talk about the shortcomings of other tribal groups. And them in distinction to our own. So the finches become a tribe. And so you're not going against your raising is going against, what is the connotation of that word tribe?
Hmm. Now, Judith Batten has raised an interesting point here. She asks, so the community has no responsibility for how its citizens are. That's really interesting. Do you think Maycomb would assume any responsibility for those streaks? Um, and the last quote we have there is really great. The thing is, you can scrub Walter Cunningham till he shines. You can put him in shoes and a new suit, but he'll never be like Jem. In other words, he'll never be anything but a Cunningham. So it's kind of a type of species there. He's a Cunningham. Does
Yeah.
let's in Judith's question, does the community have any responsibility for who these people are?
Well, it certainly absolves them of trying to change them. Yes, there's no point. And of course, the Yules seem to bear that out perfectly. The Yules, you can't, to descend to one more lower tribe. They are animals, and animals they will remain. Nobody thinks for the Yules. Uh, and so that kind of paralysis um, explained away as a genetic streak, uh, like the weather.
Hmm.
You know, it's going to come, and there's not a thing you can do about
Yeah,
it. So,
yeah. I think you're right. I think the word genetic there is the key. The community has society and Maycomb society. Maycomb doesn't believe that society shapes anything. People are shaped genetically, somehow, hereditarily. They are who they are, and they're locked in place, and they will never change. If you're a finch, you're a finch. And if you go against your raising, well, we know that you've gone against your raising. It's obvious to everyone in town.
and you're going to get your
Oh
comeuppance
yeah,
too. That's
yeah.
so. Okay, okay. As we think of the next group of quotations, the question that I'm sort of asking is, um, where and when and how does that attitude, that love of the status quo, that security in fixity, that denial of responsibility based on things simply being what they are, where do we see that attitude criticized? And it's kind of interesting to see. And here's where I think you don't really criticize it much as you go through the first half of the novel, but when you have finished the novel, if you go back and look at some of the even earliest statements, you see how they are kind of uh, foreshadowing through events and through setting that leads us to make some connections with the future that's going to happen in the second half. When we read that Maycomb was just a tired old town, um, notice being a tired old town becomes something really ugly, red slop, okay? Um, the courthouse sagging. Think about that. That courthouse is the image of the law. A lot of the action is going to take place there. And the whole courthouse is sagging. Is the law itself sagging? And then the Radley House. Uh, it almost becomes a parallel to Maycomb. Notice it too is just sagging, falling apart, gray, rain rotted. Notice the rain turns to. So the Radley House, as horrific as it is, the haunted house, Maycomb is like that house through these descriptions. There's this picket fence that runs drunkenly around, a swept yard never swept. In other words, something going into ruin and decay. A malevolent phantom. Think about that. That might be, of course, a reference to Boo, but it's certainly going to be a reference to his father. Miss Maudie will say that. And is there a malevolent phantom, Maycomb itself, its character in that sagging courthouse, as it's going to be revealed through the jury's decision? So, and then even Maudie's house. Notice Maudie is has decided her house maybe needed to burn. Maybe the need to change the settled neighborhood. Um, and maybe the only way to change the settled neighborhood is through a conflagration. So these seemingly harmless quotations early on, notice how they're beginning to weave and make connections. Mrs. DeBose, she has a drug addiction. She also has a bigotry addiction. Are those two things kind of parallel? The horror of her is not just her drug addiction, her coughing, her illness, but it is also her bigotry. Uh, Bigotry is a disease as well. Bigotry is an addiction as well. And then, of course, the mad dog. My goodness, why is that even in there? You know, this poor old dog has to get shot. Well, the lynchers are going to be compared to a mad dog. The gang of wild animals that a child could stop because they are still human. Well, are they human? Can they be stopped? They are stopped by Scout the night before the trial, but are they stopped from delivering a verdict which they must know is not based on truth or fact? So all of these symbols of decay and change from the early going wrap up as a kind of commentary to that idea of a world that shouldn't have to change because it simply is the way it is. Okay, and this brings us to Atticus. I would love to know before we get into it too far what the teacher's attitude toward Atticus is and what their students' attitude is toward
That's a
Atticus.
really good question. So let's hear what our participants have to say. How do you view Atticus, and how do your students view Atticus? There, for a period of time, when polls were taken about people who were admired in the United States, Atticus Finch came out in quite a few. And someone was telling me the other day, we were talking about this seminar, and she said that those polls still indicate that Atticus Finch is highly respected. Cindy, are you aware of these polls?
Oh,
Um,
yes, there's no question about it. And, you know, just anytime the novel comes up with friends of mine, uh, reading articles, he is a paragon. He is a model
mhm.
of right action and justice and truth and all things good about the law, for one thing.
Right.
So yes, there's no question but that he is an American hero.
Well, we have here a participant writes a very wise perception. Was Atticus Finch admired or was Gregory Peck respected? And I think a lot of people, even if you read the novel, you can't help but see it through that film, which was, for its time, a very moving film. I remember seeing it and moved quite a bit by it. Madeline writes, I like him, but he's a little blind, naive to think that Mrs. DuBose changed or that the community won't react negatively to him. Judith Batten writes that he is life worn. See what other? He's one of my heroes. Okay. How about your students? How do your students respond to Atticus? Be interesting to know, particularly in this widely diverse United States now. Um, uh, Cindy.
And the idea of criticizing Atticus is fairly new
Uh huh.
actually in the life of the novel over the last 50 years. Um, I certainly saw nothing wrong with him for a very long time and admired him tremendously. And I think certainly the movie helps to cement that impression of him. But just from the novel, you know, he says all the right things. He's just and he seems so wise and so patient and so tolerant of everybody
Hmm.
that it's hard, I think, to criticize him, or at least it was until not too long ago when people started pointing out a few freckles.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, that brings us to an interesting question. While our participants, we still have a number of people typing in on our question about Atticus. Could you just where does the novel stand right now critically among scholars? Is it still widely respected, or has it come in for some
No, it's
lumps lately?
unfortunately it's taking a good many hits
Uh huh.
these days, and it's taking them primarily well on the basis of, interestingly enough, the vilification of the Yule
Mm.
family. That is one thing that people are really
Uh
criticizing.
huh.
That Harper Lee creates a new kind of villain which exempts everyone but the lowest of the low, who are indeed so animalistic that we can't expect anything good out of them anyway. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's a new kind of fixing blame and finding a scapegoat to uh, to go after the Yules, as indeed Atticus does.
Yeah.
And in doing that, Atticus simply, again, sets up a new way not to have to be judged.
Hmm.
which
Yeah.
uh, people are criticizing a great deal now.
Yeah, yeah, she does seem to be saying, and getting back to my point about the apology for the South, she does seem to be
Mhm.
saying, look, most of us are okay, and it's this bad seed, this one group that is causing all of the problem and doing all of the ugly things you see on TV. Teresa Scott writes, Atticus is one of my favorite characters, and my students seem to like him as a hero, but at a distance until the courtroom scene. And then we're not asked, would you elaborate on the criticism of Atticus? I think we're going to get into that, aren't we? So, Renata,
Yes, to
we're
it.
going to answer your question within the next few minutes. Why don't we move ahead then? Why don't we take that as a cue to move ahead, Cindy? Let's talk about Atticus, change maker or fatalist, wise
Yes.
or naive.
In a recent scholarly article, a scholar took exception even to his advice to Scout about having to climb into someone's skin and walk around in it. This scholar pointed out that that isn't something that's possible. Now, I don't know whether to agree with him or not, or whether you all would, but it's one thing to say, okay, take a walk in my shoes. That might be good advice. Try to find out how other people feel. But to say, okay, climb into his skin and walk around in it is incredibly naive on Atticus's part, according to this scholar. Um, then the next quotation. Interestingly, and I'd love to get some ideas about what does Atticus mean by when he says we were licked 100 years ago, and and even so, we have to fight, but we're not going to win. That kind of, fatalism, does that doom Tom right from the beginning, no matter what Atticus does to prove he's innocent, which of course he does prove, but to go ahead and say, we were licked before a whole long time ago in the past. Uh, but we got to try to win anyway, but we're not going to. What in the world do we make of that quote?
And what do we make of that? I mean, that echoes the very beginning of the novel. We're talking about causation here. It
Right.
depends on where you want to place the starting point, but um,
Causation and fixity as
that's
well.
right,
Okay.
causation and fixity. Yeah, yeah,
Because of something that happened 100 years ago, and we can't change it, but we still got to try.
right. And it also, in an inverted way, it echoes the old Southern lost cause.
Yes, yes, exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
That's and then of course there is in the third quotation, um, he asks the question, but he doesn't answer it. Why reasonable people go stark raving mad when anything involving a Negro comes up? It's something he does not understand, he says.
Hmm.
Uh, what do we make of these things that are so much a part of his character? Are they good? Are they bad? Uh, and is he just uh, jousting at windmills without any real idea that he himself is capable of being a change maker?
Hmm.
And okay, that's it.
We have many comments coming in. This
Okay.
Judith Batten comments on your point about fixity. The South fixed the culture. Another comment about placing the starting point. This participant goes all the way back to the first slave ship that arrived in North America. Yes, that could be a good starting point. Atticus is
Yes.
intelligent, rational, reasonable man surrounded by ignorance and bigotry. He has to make peace with the society he lives in. He is such a hero because he doesn't give up despite knowing he won't win. Very positive attitude toward Atticus. Okay, we've got some
Yes,
more.
and I like that. I like that idea of making peace with the society he lives in. Is that's important, and that does set him apart from the young who can be a counterculture. It might just be impossible for him to be in that counterculture given
Right.
given his age and also the community he lives in.
Mhm. Okay, while other folks are responding, shall we move on to quotes 4 and 5?
Yes, again, Atticus says supposedly in 1936, the Ku Klux is gone, it'll never come back. Now, is he just trying to reassure himself or his children when he says that? Does he really believe the Ku Klux Klan is gone when it was having, of course, a brand new rise in the 1930s, and certainly in the 1950s showed no signs of disappearing. Uh, and the murder of Emmett Till showed that, where the murderers were so supported by the Klan in the mid 1950s when Harper Lee was writing this novel. And then the next quotation, which I think is an amazing quotation for students to look at because of its use of these words, the secret courts of men's hearts. Okay? Um, how and where do you change that? The secret courts of men's hearts. Uh, Atticus had no case, so perhaps his fatalism was quite simply realism, if indeed it is impossible to get into the secret courts of men's hearts. So that was another very important quotation.
Well, we have a lot of comments about Atticus. Kara writes, Atticus wants his children to be able to stand up for what is right. He knows he is going to lose, but he needs his children to see how wrong racism is. A number of people commented on the fact that Atticus is a tragic hero. This is an interesting comment. He is much more lovable as an underdog. When Atticus states that they have to fight even if they're likely to lose, that's really a lesson in character building for his children. He does the same when he makes his children read to Mrs. DuBose. I think the readers, I think readers would see Atticus differently at the time of the novel's publication than today. Comments which may have seemed heroic or genuine in the 50s may seem naive to today's readers. I like that about Atticus. He may not win, but he is teaching his children to fight for what is right, and that is where change begins within families. So, a range of opinions here about Atticus. Heroic in some ways, um, maybe a bit naive in others. A tragic hero, flawed.
Yeah.
Um,
Yes, and while not a change maker himself, he
mhm,
is a change maker because he has made his children, and in making those children aware, um, he is making change through them, and that's certainly what we're going to look at next, and what the final part of the novel seems to be heading
mhm,
towards.
mhm. Yeah,
Take a look at what Harper Lee does.
yeah. If I may jump in, I have some problems with Atticus. If we could go back to the previous slide, 28, for a moment. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I could accept Atticus making peace with his society and trying to understand his society if he showed any distance between him and Maycomb. And when he says, why reason the people go stark raving mad when anything involving a Negro comes up is something I don't pretend to understand. Wait a minute. He's in his 40s. He grew up in Alabama. History, I mean, Alabama, the entire South is besotted with history. In the first part of the novel, the first two paragraphs, his kids are talking about Stonewall Jackson. Wait a minute. If this guy does not have insights into racism a man of the world, an educated lawyer, then come on. Is this
Well,
evasion? Is he just closing his eyes here?
well, yeah, probably. Except he's also trying to be true to that dictum of walking in other people's shoes. And so he's trying to walk in the shoes of Mrs. DeBose and Alexandra, and let them off the hook a little bit because when you walk in their shoes, you have to is this fortunate or unfortunate? You have to give their outlook a hearing. Now,
Mm-hmm.
do you have to honor that outlook, or do you simply, in giving it a hearing, decide you're not going to judge it out loud?
Mm-hmm.
That is the problem. Is he's not able to speak the judgment, although it's clear where he stands. He cannot speak the judgment.
Mm-hmm. And we have some more comments. It does seem overly critical to say that Atticus didn't do enough because that's not who he is, so we can't fault him for not doing more when no one else is doing anything. Good point. The key word is reasonable there. Why reasonable people go stark raving mad. Uh, yes, reasonable people go stark raving mad. But he
He's granting them
Yeah,
reasonableness.
he's granting him
That's like the
reasonableness. He must
across.
fight for what he knows is right because he has to look in the mirror and live with his choices. He knows his children are watching and he must teach them and show them through actions. And another participant writes, agree, show them through actions. So we're getting a lot of comments about Atticus. I suspect they'll come in, but why don't we move ahead to talk about potential change? Here we have, he's saying that the Southern attitudes are irrational, so there's no reasonable arguing with them. Interesting point. Okay, so
Yeah,
shall we move ahead then, Cindy?
exactly. Okay, here we come to where Atticus is successful in creating some change, even while he looks as though he is trying to keep his children from changing things in order to protect them. Um, this comment that Scout looking back, or Harper Lee, the voice of an older Scout, says, I think is revealing in terms of showing how change is coming, and Jem is the figure of great change, because as this voice tells us, he Jem was able to break the bonds of you just be a gentleman's son. And of course, what Jem is doing is breaking away from Atticus respectfully, lovingly, but there is really very little question of what Jem is going to do. And I think for students to do some predicting of what how Jem will be in 10 years, 5 years, he'll be in the middle of the 60s then, of course. Um, and and what might students predict Jem will do based on a quotation like this, that he is already breaking the bonds of being a gentleman? And of course, what in the world does it mean to be a gentleman? And is that perhaps why Atticus can't change more? Because the dictum of being a gentleman is is so ingrained in him that he can get above his raisings in some ways, but to be a gentle man means he cannot take that step that his son is going to be able to take. So there's that quotation. There is, of course, Jim standing there while ordinarily he would uh, give prompt, if not cheerful, acquiescence to Atticus's instructions. He's changing. And he's changing, interestingly, in a funny way. He's not going to budge. The kind of the wonderful paradox of change coming by not budging from his own best instinct. And then Jem being able to say, okay, and be able to question, why do they all go out of their way to despise one another? Folks are not just folks, okay? They're filled with hatred. And Jem's understanding of that hate defines pretty much everything he says and does toward the end of the novel. He understands that hate, and he is not going to put up with it. And then there's Dill. I absolutely love Dill, and I love him as a kind of foil to Jem. Um, Dill is always watching the same things going on, but notice he too is an outsider. And I think thinking about outsiders, this novel is about outsiders. The Northerners are outsiders. Even the Northern Alabamans are outsiders. Um, the blacks are outsiders. The Ewells are outsiders. Boo is an outsider. And of course, Dill is an outsider. All these figures of outsiders, and also how they can be victimized, as in the case of both Boo and Tom Robinson, in some ways parallel each other. Boo is the ultimate insider, hidden away for his own criminal acts. And of course, Tom is the ultimate outsider who cannot be allowed to uh, have said the things he has said and live among white insiders. And then there's Dill, and Dill is going to learn from what he has seen by becoming a clown. And not any kind of clown. Notice the reverse of a clown, where nobody's going to laugh at him, but he's going to laugh at everyone else. The ultimate cynic. Uh, if we have hope and naivety in Atticus, we have almost pure cynicism in Dill and what he has learned from the horrible racism cruelty. He has, I'm going to be a new kind of clown. Okay, here's somebody with a new vision, you see. And as we think about the novel being a part of the new vision, Bill's going to be as much a part of that as Jem is. Okay, um, and the Cunninghams. Okay, aha, a new vision perhaps, because one of the Cunninghams was on the jury. And one of the things that Atticus says is, okay, this jury had to sit for a couple of hours. They didn't they didn't come to their decision in a few minutes. Now remember that jury in Money, Mississippi, they acquitted the white men that they knew had murdered Emmett Till. They acquitted him in 10 minutes. And one of them even said, well, we would have done it faster, but we decided to have a Coca-Cola. Um, Here it took them a couple of hours. They are finally beginning to think. And notice what Atticus calls it, the shadow of a beginning. And another harbinger of change, Mrs. Merriweather. Uh-oh, those folks, they stirred them up, okay? The black community has been stirred up. And of course, um, they certainly had been. Rosa Parks took her seat and her stand not long after the jury acquitted the murderers of Emmett Till. Uh, so something has stirred these folks up, um, and they are going to change as well. To go into our last thoughts, we can do that if people have quotations or if they've been writing some good things that we can share now.
They
What shall
have.
we do?
Indeed,
Okay.
Cindy. We have some interesting takes on Atticus. Megan, our teacher from New Jersey, writes, I think my students are not drawn to Atticus the way many adults are because they don't really see his dry sense of humor. Also, this is interesting, a lot of them are shocked by his lack of supervision of his children. I do explain that A, it's part of his style, and B, it was historically appropriate. So safe where they were. But when the kids show up at the jail the night of the lynch mob, the night the lynch mob is there, my students are going crazy. Another participant writes, I guess that's where I think him naive, his little supervision of his children once the case gets going on over and so on. And that's true. It's clear they're in danger in that particular scene, and he ignores it. That is a take on Atticus that I never thought of, and I never heard. It's an interesting take. How would you respond to that?
Well, I really like it, and I also like the the terrific reversal that takes place when they go down there that night is that they become their father's protector.
Hmm.
In a way that is he failing to protect them, or is Harper Lee, I think, having an even higher dramatic moment there, where she understands that it is this younger generation that is going to have to protect the law itself, as Jeb is going to, and Scout too is going to save Atticus uh, from the others, if not from himself.
Hmm. Yeah.
So all of that is very interesting.
Well,
The lack of discipline that he gives them, again, I think is just pure trust, and a faith in the goodness of people. That is Atticus's byword.
right. Well, his interpretation of the lynch mob is interesting. Later on, when he's talking about it, um, I think Jem says to him, they would have killed you. And he says, oh, no, they wouldn't have killed me, when they probably would have. And then the other thing that really disturbed me about Atticus at the end of the novel, when the sheriff is trying to tell him, look, your son didn't kill Ewell, and we're not going to try your son. And he's signaling to Atticus, look, put this behind you. We don't want to drag your kid into court. And Atticus is sitting there saying, no, we really need to do this. You're thinking, Atticus, wait a minute. The sheriff's telling you something here, my friend. Are you sure you want to drag your son through all this? The guy, you know, I, I know he's a hero, uh, not to me, but that's why this novel is great. It stirs up these kind of wonderful debates.
And Atticus is showing in that statement to that principle must be above even blood,
Mm-hmm.
you see.
Noble.
And that's and I went back one page so we could see where Jim says to Atticus about Mr. Cunningham, don't call that a blind spot,
Yeah.
okay?
Mm-hmm.
Jim is saying to Atticus, do not excuse this man. He would have killed you.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And so Jim calls a blind spot, and that's an important progression.
Yeah.
Okay, it, this the young are a work in progress in this
Right.
novel. That's what Obama said we were, by the way, in his speech the other day. We're a work in progress. These kids are a work in progress toward more honesty and more
Yeah,
courage.
but reading the novel as an historical novel, we have to keep this in context. I mean, when Jem and Scout grow up, they're not growing up in the 1960s. This is 1936, so they're growing up in the 40s and 50s, which were not exactly boom times for Black folks in the South.
No, not at all. That's why I'm saying it's really a novel about
Yeah, it's really a novel
it's
about the
really a novel
60s.
about the 50s and 60s,
Okay.
and I actually think that when we see this new novel, which was actually an earlier version, I think from what I have read, it'll be interesting to see. And you can let me know if I was wrong. I am almost sure that this newer novel is set in the 50s and
Ah,
60s, and
okay.
it deals with Atticus's fight in that period and not in the 30s,
Yeah.
because I think part of the editing that took place when she took that first version is was to set it back earlier,
Hmm.
um, as many novelists sometimes do, to in some ways mask the fact that they're writing about the present. They'll set it in the past, but they'll still be writing about the present.
Right. Right. All right, folks. Remember, you heard it here first. The new Harper Lee novel is set in the 1950s, so you can,
Okay,
you know, you
that's my story,
that's
and I'm
okay.
sticking to
Okay.
it
So
till I
you
read
you can
it.
you can trade that, retail that with your. Oh, you can say confidently. Oh, it's set in the 50s. I just happen to know that. Okay. We have some.
Yes.
We have a good question from Megan. Anybody have any ideas for a more modern day character or person we can compare to Atticus? So while we're waiting for some responses there, Cindy, why don't you wrap us up with our last two passages?
Okay. In conclusion, Atticus does say a couple of things to spark the the travel beginning steps by Jim and Dill and Scout down the road. Okay, he says, change the law. And Jeb says, well, go up to Montgomery and do it. And notice again, Atticus quite simply admits, I'm not going to see it happen. And then notice how long he thinks it's going to take for, uh, for the law to be changed. And of course, 10 years after this, 5 years after this novel was written, the Voting Act right was passed after the March in Selma. And in 1964, of course, the first law was passed. And then, of course, this final quotation of Atticus is, there's nothing more sickening to me than a low grade white man who will take advantage of a Negro's innocence. Don't fool yourselves. It's all adding up, and one of these days we're going to pay the bill for it. And I hope it's not in you children's time. And so I think a good question for your students is, um, are we still paying the bill for it, and for prejudice, for bigotry against any group of people? And in what ways? What do we mean by paying the bill? How are we paying the bill? What do we owe? And how are we still paying?
Okay. Any
And that's it.
any comments or questions there on that final question? Not an easy one to answer when we're grappling with grappling with it since the 17th century, I suppose. But here we are in
Yes.
2015 wrestling with it in Ferguson and other places. Jill Batten is typing in, we are paying through mistrust in so many communities today. Yes, good point. Um, Judith Batten, rather. Let's see, that was Jill. Judith Batten is typing in. Wait a second. While we're waiting, you have you any we two of the questions in the form related to the upcoming novel. You've already spoken about that, Cindy. Any other comments on that? Um, do you what do you have any sense of how this might affect Harper Lee's critical reputation?
Well, I don't, it's not going to help it, that's for sure. But
Mm-hmm.
I think people will find it interesting. I think it will be very exciting as a way to show how a work of art can be revised.
Mm-hmm.
Because remember, this is a prequel. This is
Right.
not a new novel. This is an earlier novel. And so to see that process whereby the real genius and art of To Kill a Mockingbird came into being from very humble beginnings
Uh-huh.
in that early version, I think will be worth it. I don't think anything's going to dim people's love for and wonderful uses of To Kill a Mockingbird. So I think things will be all right. Um, of course, there's a everyone is even wondering if she wanted it done. That's beside the point, of course, certainly now, as it often is, the
Mm-hmm.
writer is the last one to get to say how the future, how her or his future is going to be in the public eye. To Kill a Mockingbird is here forever. I don't think anything's going
I think it is. I think it's as I said earlier. I think it's a real cultural touchstone, and and when you're reading it, these critical things that we're talking about now sort of fade, and it's a great story. She was an excellent storyteller, and it just catches you up and sweeps you along, um, and it really uh, just picks you up and carries you. It's only after you put the novel down and you begin to think about it that these criticisms come in. But I think that it's
and even though there's criticism, I think the instincts of the
yeah,
novel are so perfect.
yeah.
They're its instincts are true and sharp, and I think 13-year-olds get it,
Hmm.
maybe even better than adults.
Yeah, yeah, probably so. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you seem to all agree that we're still paying a price. Judith Batten writes, with mature students compared to coming of age in Mississippi. That would be an excellent comparison. So let me just
Yes.
say, do we have any final comments, last questions, last shots, anything coming through here in the chat? Anything to wrap things up with here this evening? Okay, we're getting a lot of thank yous. And indeed, I want to thank Cindy for giving us a really wonderful seminar. Thank you. You've given us a lot to think about. I think the teachers are going to be plundering your slides quite extensively, and we hope they do. And Cindy, thank you so much. This has been a great seminar.
Thank all of you. I no greater praise than if you're able to use these things. Thanks a lot.
And thank to our participants. I mean, it's a testimony to the power of this novel and its excellence that we had such a wonderful discussion about it tonight. So thank you all for your enthusiastic and intelligent participation. And remember to check americainclass.org for our upcoming webinars. Our next one is going to be on the book thief. We're taking our focus off American history and literature for a moment and going to Nazi Germany. 7 p.m., March 17th. Don't forget to submit your evaluations. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We hope you'll be back with us again soon. Thank you and good evening.